faces here. I'd like just to take a brief few minutes to congratulate PSP Australia and wherever you are. Look, PSP Australia couldn't exist without a lot of people putting in a lot of time and effort and energy and enthusiasm, and as they expand their portfolio to cover corticobasal syndrome and multiple system atrophy, I see a big job ahead for this lay organisation, and it's a really, really important part of managing these conditions to have a lay support group that you guys can contact, and more importantly, perhaps when people aren't here, to eventually find contact and get some help and information from. So I've been involved with PSP Australia for about 5 years now, and I look forward to continuing the association. And I encourage you all to take Anne's example and put in a few hours work and effort to help support the group, because without that help, it wouldn't be here. And hopefully it will get bigger, more, better resourced into the future, but on the shoestring budget that's there, it's PSP Australia is doing a great job. And also without the help of Parkinson's Victoria, which is a little bit better resourced, couldn't work either. So one of the problems of expanding the portfolio of different conditions that PSP Australia is going to try and support is actually trying to fit all these things into one-day seminars and 90-minute or 60-minute discussions. So this start of the day, and you've got a great program today which you'll all take something away from. The start of the program really is to sort of cover how we go about making diagnoses, which presumably most of you guys have had some experience with, but just go through some of the steps that doctors think of and that the scientists think of when we're thinking about differentiating these conditions and actually what the words mean. I'll talk about some management strategies from the doctor's point of view, but I'd like to open up to questions, any questions that you'd like to ask that you don't get a chance to ask me otherwise, or don't get a chance to ask the doctors on any topic you like, hopefully with regards to the talk anyway. So I will try and cover progressive supranuclear palsy, multiple system atrophy and corticobasal syndrome. The reason that they're all related is that in these conditions, some people have very similar symptoms. To an extent, there's always slowness of movement of some sense or another. There's usually some imbalance, and there's usually some progression over a number of years. These conditions differ from Parkinson's in that they tend not to respond so well to the Parkinson medications, and that's because of some of the changes at a microscopic level in the brain. And here, out of these observations comes this sort of strategy for diagnosing patients with slowness and stiffness and balance problems, and separating them from Parkinson's disease. So let's talk about progressive supranuclear palsy. I guess these conditions have probably always been around. Parkinson's disease was first described in 1817, and it was probably known about in the centuries before that, even with some suggestions that Egyptian papyrus writings mention Parkinsonism or some symptoms that might relate to Parkinson's. So probably PSP's been around for that long as well. It was only in the 1950s and 1960s that Dr. Richardson and his patients in Toronto in Canada identified a number of patients that kind of looked a little bit like Parkinson's but didn't progress in the same way. Now, back in 1963, there were no real treatments for Parkinson's, so whether you had PSP or Parkinson's or MSA, patients tended to slowly get worse over time, and there was no tablets to help. But in fact, in the 1970s, when the Parkinson medications became available, it was clear that patients with typical Parkinson's disease got better with the tablets. The patients that Richardson described in 1963 just didn't seem to respond to the tablets. It might seem It may seem obvious to you guys, and to some extent it seems obvious to me that there is a big difference between Parkinson's and PSP, but this was not obvious to people in the 1950s and the years before that. This is an original slide that Dr. Richardson presented in 1963 to the American Academy of Neurology. So for the very first time, using this description, he was trying to argue that PSP was a different condition to Parkinson's disease. And it's these observations which will still form the basis of how we make the diagnosis. He describes this patient who he initially saw at 56 years of age, who died about 6 years later. He first presented with problems of unsteadiness of walking. Now, that might be the case in Parkinson's disease, but usually in Parkinson's disease, patients will get tremor or stiffness in the hand, not usually balance problems at all. And then a year later, one of these first patients with PSP reported some difficulty with vision and slowness of thought. Again, very unlikely, it just doesn't happen that early in Parkinson's disease. A loss of facial expression within 2 years of the unsteadiness, and then this characteristic difficulty in looking downwards. And it was this specific feature that Dr. Richardson identified in a few other patients in his clinic. He followed them over a number of years and saw they all followed a very similar sort of pattern. That they started with some balance problems and falls. They had some difficulty with slow thinking. The memory is okay, but the thinking was just a bit slow. And then the eye movements became slow and stiff. Eventually, in this patient, you can see it on the bottom, dysarthria means difficulty with speaking. The Binsky response talks about some of the things we look at in the feet, signs of muscle stiffness, nuchal dystonia, stiffness in the neck. So these are all features that we readily identify these days with PSP. And this slide will have been one of the first times it was presented to a group of neurologists saying, look, this is a different condition. And in this patient, Dr. Richardson described some other difficulties with slow movement or bradykinesia emerging 5 years after the onset. And that's really not typical for Parkinson's disease. So he successfully argued, presenting these 5 or 6 cases to a big group of neurologists for the first time, that this condition, which he called progressive supranuclear palsy, was different to Parkinson's disease. And it's this description that we use to identify patients with PSP these days. In fact, in this paper, he didn't, in 1963, when he was first describing it, he didn't call it progressive supranuclear palsy. Him and his co-workers, Dr. Ojlewski and John Steele, had some discussion for a number of months about what to call the condition. They loosely called it heterogeneous system degeneration, which is probably just as bad as calling it progressive supranuclear palsy. They did consider calling it, making it its name can't look down disease, which because of the eye movement difficulty. But in the end, they settled on this sort of mishmash of clinical and pathological words, progressive supranuclear palsy. And it's been known as that. Some people call it still Richardson-Ojlewski syndrome because of the order of the authors. John Steele was a junior doctor working with Richardson back in 1963. And at the last carers meeting, I think 2 years ago, we actually got Dr. Steele on the telephone from Guam in the Pacific Islands to talk to the group, which was quite exciting. I didn't organise something as exciting as that today. But I'm sure John will be pleased to hear that we've got another discussion with you guys, and remains strongly interested in PSP and the degree of research there. This is a photo of one of the early patients that Dr. Richardson followed. Now you might also hear this term Richardson syndrome. This is a term that I prefer to use. It's easy to say, makes a little bit, it rolls off the tongue a bit easier, and it sort of has this implied definition when you're telling family and friends that you've got Richardson syndrome rather than PSP, because Richardson syndrome, perhaps the family and friends go, great, what's that? And then if you say PSP, they say, oh, great, what's that? And you say progressive supranuclear palsy, and by that stage they're probably turned off. So we've coined this term Richardson syndrome because this description that he made back in 1963 really is a classic and enduring clinical presentation of the disease. Now there are other presentations, there are other ways that people can present with the same condition, but in terms of what we see in the clinic, he described it. And by definition, what doctors use to identify PSP compared to Parkinson's or MSA or CBS are these guidelines, a gradually progressive condition. It always happens after the age of 40. There has never been anyone in the world who's identified someone with PSP under the age of 40. There's progressive unsteadiness and falls within the first year or so of disease. That is that the balance is an early problem. And that in the following few years the eye movements must all slow down to some extent. Now, that's pretty simple guidelines, and you think that anyone could use those and make a diagnosis. And that really is the only guidelines that we have. But of course, it's not as simple as that. When you guys bring your family members or you come to the clinic, we have to sort of identify these signs. We have to put them up against the other potential causes of these symptoms and work out whether or not it is PSP. Now, from a kind of scientific or intellectual point of view, that's great to diagnose PSP. What does it mean? In terms of the patient, it means there's balance problems and visual problems. But what does it actually mean is going wrong in the brain? And I lecture a lot on this, and I like to really differentiate what the patient's experiencing and what is happening in the brain. But of course, the two are very intimately connected. So by identifying, diagnosing this group of symptoms together, we can predict with great accuracy exactly what's going wrong at a microscopic level in the brain, and to some extent can predict what parts of the brain are affected. And that's important because what happens at a microscopic level in PSP is entirely different from what happens in MSA, entirely different from what happens in Parkinson's disease, and is different microscopically to what happens in Alzheimer's or motor neuron disease or any other degenerative condition. But they're similar in the way that some of the nerve cells get a bit sick, they don't work so well, and they die back. And that's where the symptoms come from. So it's important for doctors to think carefully about the different possibilities of diagnosis, but looking for the really key signs that can identify what's going on. Now, I've already said that probably for thousands of years there has been such a condition as PSP. And a century before Richardson described the classic symptoms we use to identify PSP these days, Charles Dickens in the Tour of Two Idle Apprentices wrote this very clear description of someone in the story that sounds like they probably had PSP. He described a person with a chilled, slow, earthy, fixed old man, cadaverous man of measured, slow speech, an old man who seemed unable to wink, so his eyes didn't blink, as if his eyelids had been nailed to his forehead. The old man whose eyes, two spots on fire, had no more motion, so unable to move, than if they had been connected to the back of his skull by a screw. So we've got a very slow, softly spoken, monotonous voice, man with eyes that don't blink and don't move. And he goes on to say he had come in and shut the door, and he now sat down. He did not bend himself to sit, as other people do, but seemed to sink bolt upright as if in water until a chair stopped him. And these are pretty typical features, I think, we'd see these days of patients with PSP. So it was out there, but it was difficult for the doctors to identify. Now, McDonald Critchley, I should just take a step back. Usually when I'm giving talk to medical students or doctors or scientists, I have a lot of videos to describe the symptoms and signs. I'm not showing a lot of videos today because a lot of my patients are in the videos, and I think it's probably unfair to identify those sort of things. But you guys know a lot about what to see in PSP, so we're going to talk slightly more theoretical and give you a chance to ask questions later. This is not a video of a patient, this is a video of a neurologist taken in Melbourne in 1954. McDonald Critchley at that stage was one of the leading neurologists in the world. He had a great interest in stroke neurology, and he had a good friend in Melbourne who was a neurologist as well, and he took the steamboat over to Australia and spent some time hanging out at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, University of Melbourne, and also up in Kew and Box Hill. Now, PSP, remember, in 1954 had not been described, except perhaps by Charles Dickens. And here's a nice home video taken in one of his friends' backyards, 1953. So this is McDonald Critchley, world-famous neurologist, playing around with one of his friends, mucking around with the little dog there, chasing around. And they're playing around at sort of videotaping what someone who walks like Parkinson's might walk like before Parkinson medications. That's clearly a Parkinson's walk. I would argue that this walk he's describing that he's probably demonstrating from some of the patients he had looks very much like a PSP walk. So these intellectual, leading neurologists of the day, using their video cameras and mucking around as nerdy neurologists do, sort of demonstrating something that I've readily identified, perhaps some of you guys might identify as the walk of Parkinson's, and then subsequently the walk of someone with PSP. So while there was no name for PSP in 1953, the doctors were obviously clued on there were some subtle differences, and these differences are really important when it comes to what's underlying, what's happening in the brain. And what is happening in the brain is the accumulation of these little black dots that shouldn't be there. These are certain proteins that accumulate in the brain to give us an idea that the nerve cells are sick and that part of the brain's not working well. And if we're good at diagnosing PSP, we're good at predicting that this is happening in the brain. And if we're good at doing that, then if there's a treatment that can stop these bits of protein accumulating in the brain or the nerve cells getting sick, then we're able to improve the condition. I'll talk about treatment and research programs at the end. So multiple system atrophy, it's different in PSP. The walking is not the same as that. The microscopic findings are not the same as that. And the natural history is not the same as that. But it was also described in the 1960s. Again, from a group of a couple of different neurologists who were keenly looking at their patients and identified a cluster of certain symptoms and signs that happen in the same patients. Most importantly, in this condition, multiple system atrophy, patients had disease affecting their automatic nervous system. And that the automatic nervous system is the nervous system that you don't think about, it just happens automatically. So it controls blood pressure, it controls bladder, it controls bowel, it controls temperature, it controls sweating, pupil size, heart rate, and sexual function. So the automatic nervous system is a very important part of the nervous system, but in multiple system atrophy, MSA, it tends to get affected early. Constipation, bladder problems, low blood pressure are early and typical signs, and they often cause problems even before the slowness and balance problems emerge. Now, when I describe it like that, it's easy to tell the difference between PSP that we just looked at and MSA we're talking about now. But in fact, it's not that easy sometimes, and I have difficulty separating these two conditions on occasions as well. In MSA, in addition to that automatic nervous system getting affected, patients do develop Parkinsonism, and by that I mean slowness and stiffness in the muscles and balance problems. And in MSA, the balance problems can perhaps be even worse than in PSP or Parkinson's. And often the Parkinson medications do not improve the symptoms in MSA. So you can see these conditions are related. They've both got slowness of movement, but the additional features are a little bit different. And I highlight to the medical students and neurologists I talk to and look for those other signs to try and separate these conditions from themselves and also from Parkinson's disease. What a doctor will use to to diagnose MSA is first identifying the presence of this imbalance, and then measure various different things with the automatic nervous system. So I might be looking at the blood pressure to drop from lying to standing. That's typical in multiple system atrophy. We might be looking at bladder function, doing bladder tests, or taking a history of the urgency of going to the toilet, or going to the toilet a lot at night time, or going frequently during the day. Now I recognise there's a lot of reasons why people get out of bed a lot at night time to go to the toilet, or suffer from constipation. But as doctors, we try and put these groups of symptoms together to come up with a definite diagnosis. In Parkinson's disease, it will almost always start on one side and not the other. In multiple system atrophy, the symptoms usually affect both sides to start off with, so another tool that doctors use to diagnose MSA. I've already said that balance is usually affected, and we talk about stiffness. There's a lot more stiffness in MSA in the limbs, in the arms and legs, than what there is in Parkinson's disease. So I'll show you a picture in a minute, but there's under the microscope, it looks entirely different to a specialist anyway. I recognise there's not, people don't look down the microscope every day, you probably see a mishmash of black and white and pink and that's it. But the characteristics under the microscope are entirely different in MSA to PSP. So from my point of view, again, if we're treating the conditions, they're probably going to require, if we're going to cure the conditions, they're probably going to require different treatments, because under the microscope there's different things going on. They look similar in life, but at a microscopic level they're entirely different processes. So a cure for PSP will not mean a cure for MSA, and vice versa, probably. Now we come to corticobasal syndrome. It's going to be difficult to get this concept across with so much rain. Hopefully you can hear me well. Corticobasal syndrome is what we see, what you experience, but doesn't necessarily imply anything about what's happening under the microscope. So corticobasal syndrome is a group of clinical signs. Now those clinical signs, those symptoms, can be caused by stroke. They can be caused by Alzheimer's disease. They can be caused by the microscopic changes of PSP, or even Parkinson's. So under the microscope we might see stroke, we might see PSP, we might see Alzheimer's, or we might see this condition called corticobasal degeneration. But in life we see the same symptoms. So the same symptoms can come up almost regardless of what the disease is underlying. So we prefer this term corticobasal syndrome because it really describes a group of symptoms. It doesn't tell us what's happening at a microscopic level. At the moment we don't have the tools to accurately separate whether or not someone with corticobasal syndrome symptoms has Alzheimer's or PSP or Parkinson's or stroke. We're working on it. There's a lot of research that I'm involved in at the moment to try and separate these things. But as I said with the other conditions, we want to be able to diagnose these things accurately so that we can get a specific treatment for the microscopic problem that's happening. And in CBS, or corticobasal syndrome, we don't do that very well at the moment. So what does CBS, or corticobasal syndrome, really imply? Well, it's usually a syndrome that affects people in their 70s. It describes a progressive loss of movement in a limb, usually an arm, as well as in that arm, muscle spasms, incoordination, tremor, jerking. Often it's associated with some imbalance, often it's associated with some memory loss, and often it's associated with some visual disturbance. And these are common features with Parkinson's, with PSP, with stroke, with Alzheimer's disease. And at the moment we don't have great clues to separate these underlying conditions, but in life, regardless of the disease almost, the condition progresses in about the same way. But if we're looking for a cure, what we want to do is identify what the microscopic changes are so we can stop them. So when I say corticobasal syndrome, I'm not saying what the disease is because often I won't know. But it's one of the challenges we have in science to try and separate out the different causes of these symptoms. Does that kind of make sense? By separating what we see as doctors, what we experience as patients and caregivers, and what's happening at a microscopic level. It'd be easy if we could take the brain out, have a look at it and put it back in, but we can't do that at the moment. So let's talk about management. There's some pretty simple, straightforward principles which I teach the medical students and the allied healthcare workers and the doctors about what the best way to do things are in terms of managing the various different symptoms, the commonalities and the unique things of these different conditions. At the moment, in these three different groups of conditions, we don't have a curative treatment. There's no known therapy that substantially changes the course of the condition. That is, we don't have something at the moment that definitely makes people live for a year or two or three longer than what they were going to live without the treatment. That's a shame, it's a pity, but it's also the source of a lot of interest and research effort. And in fact, we predict that something's going to help cure PSP is going to be something that's going to help cure Alzheimer's disease. And given that probably 30 or 40% of us will die with some Alzheimer's disease change in the brain, that's a lot of people that could potentially be treated from a cure. So there's a lot of interest from drug companies and national research bodies in investing research money into PSP because it will probably have direct translation into Alzheimer's. So that's a good thing, that's a good position for PSP to be in, because while PSP possibly affects thousands of patients and people in Australia, Alzheimer's affects tens and hundreds of thousands of people. So PSP is a good research model for Alzheimer's disease, and that's where we are seeing some benefits flow through. My view is, and this is not a view shared by many neurologists, my view is that the diagnosis should be made early. There's no point dilly-dallying around by using phrases like atypical Parkinsonism or something like Parkinson's, but I'm not sure, or maybe Alzheimer's, we'll see what happens in 3 years' time. I don't think that gives much hope or focus for patients or the caregivers. I do know of neurologists in this town and other towns where the diagnosis of PSP will be avoided until the patient's in a nursing home, which I think is a great pity. And we're working on educating people to avoid that approach. And I think one of the reasons people do that is it can be difficult to be definite with a diagnosis. It's not nice to give a diagnosis where we also say, well, actually there's no treatment changes the course of the condition. But alternatively, I think it's important to deliver the diagnosis with compassion and explain the context of the diagnosis so people have something to deal with and something to talk about and something to sort of clears the path forward. That's not a universally relevant experience. So despite me saying there's not a cure or there's not a tablet that suddenly changes how people are, usually, it's important to know there's a lot of things that can be done over the course of a condition that can improve symptoms and can probably improve quality of life. And it's important to explore those possible strategies, both using medicines and especially using other healthcare professionals, whether they're masseurs or physiotherapists or occupational therapists or social workers or speech therapists or psychologists, acupuncturists, whatever. And that's a really important component of actually making the diagnosis and getting management strategies going into the future. So it is disappointing to say there's no cure for PSP, but in fact, when I think of all the other conditions that there are that affect humanity, there's really not many things that can be cured. Now, sure, we have a very beautiful biological treatment, for example, for type 1 diabetes, but no one's ever cured of type 1 diabetes. They take their treatment and they suffer problems from it, but it's not cured. We can cure pneumonia. We can't cure heart disease. People have to take tablets from it and they suffer from it. In that sense, PSP is in the same ballpark as these other conditions we have some sort of treatment for without a cure. But PSP is a specific neurodegenerative condition which we know a lot about, and I'd be hopeful that in fact that we can come up with a cure for PSP or a substantial life-changing treatment, perhaps ahead of things like heart disease, because there's so many different factors that go into that, and so many different factors that go into PSP, into diabetes. In PSP, it's probably just one or two tiny things that are going wrong on a microscopic level. We don't have that cure yet, but the research is going ahead very quickly, and we're learning a lot more about it. So what are the things that we have at the moment that can help some of the symptoms of PSP without curing them? Well, and everyone's experience of this, patient's experience of this is kind of different, but muscle stiffness and slowness of movement are an inherent component, to some extent, in everyone with PSP. Now, sometimes that muscle stiffness and slowness gets in the way of good level of function, and sometimes we can use Parkinson medications to subtly or moderately improve the symptoms of muscle stiffness. Now, it's not much point if you're walking slowly but still falling over, and we give you Parkinson medications and you walk faster, it just means you're going to fall faster. So judging whether or not these medications are useful is a difficult thing, and often we'll try these tablets. If they don't work at a small dose, we push up the dose, and if the dose doesn't work, if it doesn't work at a high dose, then we stop them. It's generally worth trying if there's symptoms of muscle stiffness and slowness that are getting in the way of quality of life, and if they're going to be improved, it's going to improve quality of life, then we might try these tablets. They do have their own side effects, and for example, that thing about if you're walking faster, you're falling faster is an important thing to consider. So that's something that we think about when we start the tablets. There's other types of Parkinson tablets, some of which you might have heard of. Ciprol, probably not useful. Amantadine or Simitril is a medication that actually was developed in the 1960s as an anti-flu medication. But in the occasional patient with PSP, for example, it can actually improve walking, sometimes improve speech, and stop that tendency for the feet to get stuck on the ground and get freezing. Causes constipation, causes swollen ankles, reduces your risk of getting the flu, and it doesn't help that many people, but occasionally we can have dramatic responses. So I'll usually try that medication unless there's a reason not to, and stop it if it doesn't help. There's some antidepressants. One that I use a fair bit is Ender. It comes from the group of antidepressants. We don't use it for depression and PSP. We use it because occasionally just changing the brain chemicals can improve the quality of speech or the balance. And again, it probably helps less than 10% of people, perhaps less than 5%, but on the occasions when it works, it tends to work well and help symptoms for 6 or 12 months. Again, not curing the disease, but sometimes improving quality of speech and sometimes balance as well. In terms of the sedatives and hypnotics, sleep disturbance is kind of common in PSP. People find it difficult to fall asleep, or they'll wake up a lot at night time. And having 3 kids under the age of 6, I know what it's like to be sleep deprived. And I know I don't function too well if the kids have been up all night. But if that's part of every single night for years, then I can imagine with PSP you're going to function less well if you're not sleeping properly. And although in the general community we don't like to just prescribe sleeping tablets, in PSP it's going to make you function better during the day. If you're having a block of 5 or 6 hours sleep, even if it's with a sleeping tablet, that's better than not taking. So that's a good strategy, a simple way to get actually the best out of the day. There's been a bit of focus on Stilnox or Zolpidem, given some research, or not some research, some case reports that have even made it onto Australian Story and into the lay literature. It is a good sedative, so from that point of view it's good to help sleep disturbance in PSP. In the rare case, and it may be 1 out of 100 people, the medication appears to improve walking, sometimes speech, but it's got substantial side effects in terms of making people feel quite drowsy as well, so it's not a tablet you can necessarily take in the morning. On the off chance that there might be a miracle response to it, even if it's only for 6 or 12 months, it's worth trying with the recognition there are side effects. And I sometimes try it. I've not had any response. None of my patients have improved with this. but there are definite reliable case reports out there of that happening. Those of you who've read the literature and read the newsletters on PSP will know of coenzyme Q10. This is a dietary supplement that has been around for some decades. Probably helpful in heart disease, maybe helpful in Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, it may be helpful in PSP. It probably doesn't have any side effects. There was a clinical trial about 5 years ago which claims to have shown a significant improvement in 6 weeks in a group of patients with PSP who took a moderate dose of coenzyme Q10, about 1,000 milligrams, which at high street pharmacy values would be about $10 a day of drug. I don't believe the trial. Coenzyme Q10 is not supposed to be a symptomatic treatment, so we wouldn't expect people to feel better on it. We would expect, if it was going to work, that over years people would do better on it than off it. And so there's no way to explain why in that small trial of about 24 people, those who took the drug actually felt better after 6 weeks. And in any case, the improvement was only 1 point on the or 1.5 points on the rating scale, which is well within the range of error that we have. So I say it's a fluke. Poor study in terms of a small size, and it's not backed up by any pre-existing hypothesis. So, you know, if some hope, there's probably no downside taking coenzyme Q10 apart from the cost. Some people source it from places like the internet. We use botulinum toxin injections, so Botox injections, frequently in PSP because muscle stiffness is a big problem, causing muscle discomfort. Blepharospasm is the word we use to describe the eye's tendency to close over and the pressure that people feel around the eyes and the drooping of the eyelids. And we can use toxin quite successfully to improve those symptoms. Sometimes we use it in the neck, for muscle stiffness and spasms in the arms. Vitamin D and calcium supplements should be considered because of the tendency to fall over. We want the bones to be as strong as possible. And I guess a lot of people with PSP will spend less time basking out in the sun or running around the golf course, getting their normal natural vitamin D. So supplementing that's probably not a bad idea. Those treatments I've just spoken about, despite the microscopic changes being completely different between MSA, PSP, and some cases CBS, in fact the symptomatic treatment that I've just described applies to all 3 conditions. So if there is muscle stiffness and slowness, we'll often try the Parkinson medications and corticobasal syndrome. Specifically, in this patient, you can see there's spasm in this left arm. The arm doesn't move, it's pretty useless actually, it just sits there and it's a bit jerky and to some extent painful. So in Fran here we injected up in the biceps and down in the forearm to reduce the muscle spasm. We injected with botulinum toxin and that helped relieve some problems. Sometimes we'll inject in the small muscles of the hand in corticobasal syndrome because they can sort of close up as well, more so than in PSP. And also we use sedatives like clonazepam when the jerking of the arm becomes a real problem. Otherwise, the other treatments also hold true. So, in multiple system atrophy, yes, we use the Parkinson medications as I described before. We have a big role to play using medication to control the problems of the automatic nervous system. So there's lots of tablets that affect the automatic nervous system. So in MSA, we might look at managing the blood pressure by pushing it up, because the blood pressure is often very low. We might suggest people wear compression stockings or elevate the head of the bed to keep the blood pressure to the head as even as possible throughout the day and night. Of course, we look at avoiding dehydration. We'll remove other medications that tend to drop the blood pressure as well. So tablets got a big role to play. There's 4 or 5 different tablets we can use to bump the blood pressure up. We obviously have lots of tablets that affect the bladder as well, and in multiple system atrophy, when the automatic nervous system gets damaged, the bladder, if someone's going to the toilet 10 times a day, well, we might use tablets to slow that down, or even surgical intervention to put a tube in to let the bladder drain by itself. Normal treatment for constipation in MSA or Parkinson's, or to some extent in PSP, would be using laxatives. And there's treatment for erectile dysfunction in men, which is usually an early sign and usually quite severe early in MSA. So there's sort of tablets that we can try. None of those, on that list there was nothing that cures things, but you can see if we pinpoint certain symptoms, if they're getting in the way of things or reducing quality of life, we can focus on them and use a class of medications to adjust that issue. Now, physical therapies are at least, if not much more important than the medical therapies, because of the impact of the balance problems and the swallowing problems and the communication difficulties and so on. For postural instability and tendency to fall, I recommend in all patients physical therapy, which might include strategy training. So it's working with a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist, working out the safest ways to do things like get on and off chairs, into and out of the toilet, into and out of the car, and so on. Physiotherapy is something that, and exercises, exercise therapy is something that's important to continue with, to keep range of movement, strength and endurance, because inevitably that's going to become harder to keep as these conditions progress. And that's a universal truth, I guess, as we all get older. And in that sort of strategy, working with the physio, we get the physios talk to caregivers and help set up the home and that sort of thing to make sure that everyone's working from the same sort of approach to keep things. It's a very important role of that. Of course, with this slow movement of speech and swallowing, then communication can become difficult, and the speech therapists are expert in trying different strategies to help with communication. That's sometimes an amplifier, sometimes a communication board, sometimes just simply training everyone to slow down and just one word at a time discussions. Dr. Howe will talk about advanced feeding therapies options. Visual disturbance in Parkinson's. Sometimes prisms help to focus the eyes, but because it's a progressive condition, an $800 pair of prisms made by the ophthalmologist might be useful for about 3 weeks, but then become unuseful and have to be replaced. So some people will try it once, but it's not worth trying several times because the vision tends to change. Practical measures like elevating reading material up here rather than down here, or food on an elevated platform rather than down on the table, can help overcome the difficulty of the eyes looking down. In multiple system atrophy, there's a specific thing where the sleeping becomes disrupted, and that can lead to people waking up a lot at night time or feeling very tired when they wake up in the morning, or even having breathing problems overnight, such that they're sort of stopping breathing. So most patients who are diagnosed with multiple system atrophy, I'll get them to have a sleep study with one of my sleep physician colleagues, or one of a couple of them, to work out to what extent the sleep's affected. And that happens at a microscopic level, the effect of the sleep. But if we treat the sleep problem, so the low oxygen or high carbon dioxide overnight, with a mask or something like that we do for example, sleep apnea, people can feel a lot better. And we know when we do that, for example, in motor neuron disease, people can actually live a bit longer. I think in MSA, if we do the same study, people, I'm not sure if they live longer, but they would certainly feel better for longer during the condition. So sleep studies are an important part of the management of MSA, and I use it early on. Other physical therapy, so we're talking about the muscles and body slowing down and stiffening up. Whatever helps is a good idea to use, and use it frequently. And I have patients that use acupuncture, massage, and gentle passive stretching. Any of them that work, or all of them that work. Some of them get along with well and improve the symptoms. Now, these therapies aren't for everyone, and of course, in general, they're not really covered by the NDS. But we know for sure in Parkinson's, for example, that massage once every 2 weeks improves quality of life, presumably because it helps with muscle stiffness in a way that the tablets don't. We're talking about muscle stiffness and all these conditions that don't really improve with tablets, so massage should help. And I recommend it to a lot of people. Finding the right masseur, for example, can be difficult, and having someone who understands what we're trying to aim at and get out of it is the biggest challenge. But speaking to the local masseurs, explaining the symptoms, or contacting. I think you guys have a list of masseurs that know Parkinson's disease? Not really?
We would only work with an massage therapist who's critical or local to the
Yeah, your local masseur can get information from Parkinson's Vic. I work with Jenny Drummond, who's a masseur who's been interested in Parkinsonism and treating it for the last 7 or 8 years. And she works with us because it's difficult to actually pick the person on the high street who's going to do a good job. So if you find someone, it's a good idea to let everyone else know. And of course, the rest of the allied healthcare staff team is important. So I guess one of the things I'm sure you're going to ask me over the next 10 minutes is what's happening with treatments for these conditions. And hopefully I've impressed upon you that it's important for us to clarify the diagnosis, important medical education for doctors and GPs and neurologists and medical students to understand the important differences between these conditions so that we can reliably and early predict what's going on a microscopic level. And understanding what's going on a microscopic level is increasing exponentially. We know a lot more than 5 years ago, and 5 years ago we knew a lot more than the 5 years before that. There have been 2 large commercially sponsored international studies using drugs that are in PSP that are predicted to stop that protein, the little black spots I showed you on the screen, predicted to stop that accumulation. The first trial hasn't been formally reported, but an announcement was made to the stock exchange about 3 months ago that the trial was negative, so it didn't show any benefit on their outcome measure. Now, that's obviously disappointing. It raises the questions about what their outcome measure, what was being measured. Obviously, we weren't looking at the brain of these people because people are still alive. Was the drug getting in properly? Were we measuring the right thing? And what happens in a couple of years' time after they've been taking the drug? Our measurement strategies for working out how bad PSP is are pretty subtle, and they can change by a couple of points between morning and night, and certainly a couple of points between week in, week out. So measuring a trial where we're seeing patients and we're giving them a score, it's really a subjective score, is a difficult way to be sure whether or not the tablet's working or not. Now, as it was set up, the trial on the Noscira trial was negative. And I suspect they won't be investing more money in that, despite the possibility of it actually helping in Alzheimer's disease. We've been involved with the Devunatide trial done by Alon of Canada. It's a large multi-centre study, 43 centres around the world, recruiting about 300 patients with PSP. Through our centre here in Melbourne, we recruited the largest number for the trial, and some of you guys were involved, and thank you. We screened 17 patients. I think we had 14 people that are just about to finish up the trial. Again, we don't have any results whatsoever. I don't know what my patients were getting. They might have all been on placebo, all on drug. I have no way of guessing. That means it's a good trial, but we shouldn't know. It's a nasal spray, which should send a chemical up to the brain to try and stop those proteins accumulating. Works well in animal models and has been safe and well tolerated at peak doses in various other disease models. It's not been proven to help anything yet, and we look forward with enthusiasm to getting some results, possibly as early as March next year, and certainly by the middle of next year. The study is pretty well controlled, but it suffers the same problem. There's no actually super objective way of measuring how bad PSP is. So if a person who's doctor who's rating the patient has a bad day and scores 42 when it should be really 43, that can affect the result. And it really does rely on how we ask the questions and how involved people are. And that's all right for our 17 patients, but we're dealing with 42 other centres around the world who have their own doctors doing their own way. And so there are some worries about this method of studying PSP. Nevertheless, if they've set a pretty achievable goal of showing improvement, so if there really is an improvement, we should be powered in the trial to work it out. And if there is that improvement, CSL have already engaged me to advise them about bringing the drug into Australia. It's going to be a bit of a hard sell, as the drug will cost between $30,000 and $50,000 a year to the PBS. And you can imagine that the PBS is a bit stretched of funds at the moment. And the trial isn't really designed in a nice way to convince the Australian government to spend that sort of money. So there's a fair bit of work to be done before it got in. But if the first step obviously is to show that improvement that would come out from the basic figures in the trial, hopefully between March and the middle of next year. But equally as perhaps not as important as getting that drug out, important is the fact that there are people who are developing strategies to attack those microscopic changes, and they're being moved forward to these very expensive, hundreds of millions of dollars it costs to run these trials. Someone's got to come up with that money, and the only reason they come up with the money is because they think they've got a treatment that's going to treat Alzheimer's. And if someone develops a treatment that's going to cure or improve Alzheimer's, they'll make a lot of money. So that's why there's investment coming. And PSP is a good model to treat Alzheimer's, to test Alzheimer's theories with. That's good for PSP because it means there's a lot of interest in it. And there'll be more studies in that nature coming along into the future using slightly different strategies. People ask me about stem cells. From the slides, a slide I show you of those black dots in the brain, it's a very long step to think we can just inject some stem cells from 15 fetuses and think that it's going to recapitulate the brain. It just doesn't happen that way. Stem cell research is a very important form of research to see what happens with cells and why they might get sick. In terms of transplantation, it's not a viable option in the near future for any of the conditions that we have, PSP, CBS, or MSA. There are places where you can go around the world, Germany, China, Holland, where you can get your own stem cells taken out and re-injected into your brain or your blood or under the skin. There's absolutely not a skerrick of evidence or a good reason or hypothesis why that should work. And it has never been shown to work, and no one's even tried to show that it works. It will cost you $30,000 or $35,000 a pop. But rather worryingly, you get half the price if you're prepared to go on the internet, on television, and say that it worked for you. So approach these things with great scepticism and due diligence. So finally, what are we doing locally to look at these conditions? There's no big coordinated research effort in MSA in Australia. There is a big European study group. They've got over about 2,000 patients with MSA. They've got on a database with a lot of doctors involved. So there's no way we could replicate that, and we should be rather focusing on something else. So there is a big European effort in MSA. We're not missing out on it, but they're doing things that we'll be able to use in the future. We're doing a lot on PSP in Australia, including being involved in the commercial trials, but also one of our focuses at the moment is to try and work out a very objective way of measuring how bad PSP is. And I'm interested in having anyone volunteer for a study that we're just starting up at the moment at the Alfred Hospital, where we're using magnetic brain stimulation to measure some of those things you can see at a microscopic level, to measure how well the nerves are working, and then tracking that over time. In a pilot study I did with my PhD student over in Rome, we measured 9 patients with PSP at the start of this trial, and then 12 months later, just giving some magnetic pulses to the brain. And we measured that reliably deteriorated over that 12 months in the same way as the clinical rating scale. So we think this is probably going to be a good objective measure of how bad PSP is. It'd be great if any of these trials use that measure, because then they could say, regardless of who's scoring the patient, if you're doing this objective measure where you're measuring an magnetic impulse in the brain, it can be given exactly the same in Melbourne as it can in Calgary or in Buenos Aires, then we can standardise it throughout the world. And we have a study through the Alfred Hospital that's going to go over the next 2 years, where we're going to do this magnetic impulse every 6 months on patients with PSP, MSA, Parkinson's and controls. So those of you who don't have any diagnosis, it's good to have you involved as well. We can measure what happens and see how it changes over time. And we're expecting from our pilot data from Rome that we'll be able to measure a deterioration over time or a change over time that we can use as a standard, and then hopefully use it in a trial to try and slow that down. There's other studies we're doing at the moment. We've sort of run out of time to talk about them. Any questions? Is it working?
Hi David, I don't know if you remember me, Hazel, who was in the trial, the Jordan trial. He deteriorated greatly, which we knew would happen. One of the biggest symptoms of PSP is the coughing and choking. My question is probably a bit personal, and probably it's like asking you how long is a piece of string. But is he likely to get that choking now on he virtually is on his deathbed? So is that likely to occur with him?
Yes, so the question was about the coughing and choking and gagging that comes with PSP. And in fact, to some extent it's a feature in advanced MSA as well. So the sensation, there's nothing wrong with sensation or feeling in people who have PSP or MSA, but the movements are slow. So in fact what's happening in the throat is that the movements are so slow and uncoordinated that at stages of the swallowing there's just no movement. So you've got food sitting anywhere from the lips to the stomach or the lungs, and because the feeling's intact you can generate a gag response. But a gag response is not the sort of normal gagging that we would get, but it's a very slow, stiff spasm that can actually result in a very hoarse gurgle or a groaning sigh, if you like. And that, in many situations, that can cause some distress to see and also distress for the patient. The question is, if anyone's likely to get that, well, I don't know. It's a common sign, and it probably, to some extent, affects people, 80 or 90% of people with these conditions. Now, there's people that, and probably because of just the balance of how things progress over time, some people get it a little bit earlier and get it frequently. Other people might only have 1 or 2 episodes. I don't know the difference between somebody gets it a lot, someone gets it infrequently. Look, there's no easy, straightforward way to treat it if it comes up, except to know that if someone passes out from one of those gagging episodes, then the muscles will relax. So if you sort of black out, that's a treatment for the spasm. Sometimes just stimulation under the tongue or around the mouth can actually stop the spasm by sort of tricking the brain into forgetting that spasm in here and feeling there. Some people will use nebulized saline, so just to keep the mouth moist. It takes a bit of a while to set that up, but if there's a whole lot of coughing that's happening one evening, it might be worth trying. Sedatives or even opiates, so painkillers and morphine, that sort of thing, can help relax as well. So that's useful if there's a build-up of those sort of symptoms in an evening. But probably if there's only one episode, getting the nebulizer on or the morphine mixture in probably won't work by the time the episode's finished.
I'm just curious about the jaw of my mother who has PSP and I'm noticing time and time again now, almost maybe once or twice a week at least, if not almost every day. The jaw is freezing up and I'm really scared when I see that happening because I'm worried that the food is going to go back into her throat. And because she eats lots of chocolate biscuits on her own, which is fine. But the thing is, I'm just scared that she's going to have a problem with that when the people in the nursing home are not there. And she might choke and they don't know.
Sure. So the question was about the jaw spasm and jaw closure. Spasm in the muscles around the head and neck is typical in PSP, and it can happen whether it's in the neck muscles, the swallowing muscles, the tongue muscles, or the jaw. And it's of course very difficult to get food in or look after the hygiene of the mouth, or you can get fluid in when the jaw is tending to be closed.
It's like during the meal it's stuck as well.
Sorry?
During her meal.
During the meal, it will get stuck as well, sure. So sometimes we use botulinum toxin, as we've discussed, to try and loosen up that muscle a little bit, particularly if it's becoming a problem of getting adequate nutrition in. It never ceases to amaze me how infrequently aspiration or asphyxiation occurs, even in a setting where it seems to be no movement of the tongue or the swallowing muscles. So all I can say is that, there might be choppy bickies stuck in there, but it's amazing how infrequently that causes problems. And maybe that's because the muscles are so stiff and slow, just nothing can get down. And when they actually do move, they move in the right direction. It's important not to force things down. I think the most problems can come when you've got, when you're an hour and a half into the meal and you just want to get it done so you can get off to the next thing. Sometimes if we're pushing things into the mouth, that's going to cause more problems. It's better just to let them sit on the top of the tongue. But, it's a more or less a universal experience in advanced PSP, and it surprises me how infrequent it causes problems. It certainly does. The jaw stiffness can be uncomfortable, but we treat that with Botox, so weakening the muscles around the jaw.
I want to ask a question about physiotherapists. I find the thing they difficult to get them to do it. And I fear that the trouble is that they don't know what damage they might cause. And I just can't solve it.
So that's so the question is about how to negotiate with a physiotherapist to do the right thing. So physiotherapists, from my experience, don't like to touch patients too much. They don't give massage. They're not there to crack the back. They're not there to mobilise joints. They're there to really train you how to do things. In the main, of course, there are physiotherapists who get their hands on a little bit more than that, but physiotherapists are there really to teach strategies, to give you guidance to improve your endurance and your strength, and it's through that there should be an improved performance or maintenance of the level of function. Now, we don't really go to physios to make the muscles more supple and get massage and stretching and that sort of thing. Well, that might be a component of the exercise. Their remit really is to teach you ways to do things safely and maintain the level of function. Now, it's true that some people are more experienced with that than others, and there's only several thousand people in Australia with PSP. You can imagine That's less than one patient per physio around Australia, so most physios won't have first-hand experience of it. You'd hope that they'd contact Parkinson's Vic or PSP Australia or their mentors around. There's plenty of mentors, physiotherapists who are very experienced with Parkinsonism. It would make some good going there. But yeah, look, you can't get the best out of you can't get the most out of every physio purely because of the frequency of their experience, probably. Yes.
Hello? I'm sure there's lots of other questions that you have for Dr. Williams. It's 10 past 11 at the moment, so we'll just come to a close now with this topic. If you have any more questions, you can, as Dr. Williams said, you can phone into Parkinson's Victoria and speak to myself or Victor. We have Rhiannon also in the health team, and we'll be more than happy to do the best we can.